And they developed these techniques specifically to enable them to control larger countries and sometimes to destroy larger countries. And the way they do it is called the balance of power, where they get larger countries to oppose each other and to fight each other and to exhaust their strength by fighting each other, while the British kind of play in a middleman role, as supervising everything and in some ways manipulating both sides.
Hoy entrevistamos a Richard Poe, quien sostiene que Wikileaks y Julian Assange fueron creados por la inteligencia británica y que todo parte pues de su actuación para influir en las elecciones kenianas de 2007, apoyando al candidato Odinga y favoreciendo por supuesto al Reino Unido. Todo esto con la coordinación de la red de George Soros. También sostiene que muchos acontecimientos geopolíticos como el globalismo y las revoluciones de color tienen orígenes británicos y están destinados siempre pues, a controlar naciones poderosas, en este caso como Estados Unidos y China, mediante sofisticadas técnicas de manipulación, de alianzas y de finanzas. Poe subraya la perdurable fuerza de la influencia británica y afirma que los conflictos contemporáneos y las estrategias económicas pues, sirven a menudo a estos intereses británicos para mantener su hegemonía mundial. Bienvenidos, queridos amigos, pues hoy tenemos la visita especial de Richard Poe. Richard, como saben, es un autor y periodista galardonado. Es conocido por ser varias veces autor bestseller del New York Times. Ha escrito ya pues unos cuantos libros extensamente sobre temas como negocios, ciencia, historia y política. Es un experto en el tema del Reino Unido. Y entre sus obras más destacadas pues se encuentran The Shadow Party, que lo escribió con David Horowitz, y The Instant Factor con Wim Wagner. Aparte pues ha sido parte de varios medios, ha sido editor senior de varias revistas y ha sido reportero del New York Post. Acaba de escribir un libro fascinante sobre cómo el comunismo realmente es una producción británica y no de los judíos. Y bueno, hoy va a estar con nosotros. Antes de empezar con la entrevista te ruego que actives la campanita. Esta va a ser una entrevista extraordinaria donde nos va pues a comentar muchas cosas de muchísimo interés, sobre todo de lo que yo denomino el imperio del mal. Hay que verla con detenimiento y quizás hasta 2 o 3 veces, ¿no? Extraordinaria. Entonces, recuerda, activa la campanita, seguramente estás suscrito al canal, pero no te llegan las notificaciones porque la campanita pues no está activa. Bueno, arrancamos. Mr. Richard, you conclude that WikiLeaks was initially used by the British Secret Services as a platform to instigate the Kenyan election crisis. It suggests that Assange was recruited and manipulated by these services to serve as an agent of influence for the British Empire. Can you help us understand how you came to those conclusions?
Well, Assange himself boasted about actually changing the result of Kenya's election in 2007. And this was just after he started WikiLeaks. It was only registered just a few months before. And then the Kenyan, let's call it a color revolution, occurred in 2007. And Assange personally took credit for it. He said that it was all him. He boasted about it in interviews, and one in particular in the UK newspaper, The Guardian. So how did he do this? Well, in fact, he was exaggerating. He didn't do it single-handedly. He helped to do it, but he had to work together with the British government and with the NGO network of George Soros. And they're the ones actually who did it. They're the ones who did the hard work on the ground that Assange took credit for. So the fact that Assange boasted about that and claimed that he and WikiLeaks had accomplished that, I think is very strong evidence that he was very well aware that his efforts were coordinated with these other players. And I'll name the British Foreign Office, another British government agency called DFID. I forget what that stands for, the Department for International Development, I think. And then the George Soros Network in Kenya, there was a Open Society Institute branch that handled East Africa, and they had funded all these protesters who eventually perpetrated the color revolution, and which exploded very quickly into violence. And so all of these things, Assange certainly knew that he didn't bring out the protesters, and he didn't uh, play the role of the British Foreign Office, which actually officially put forth a joint statement after the election within hours of the vote coming in. The British Foreign Office plus this DFID that I mentioned, both British government agencies, they put out a joint statement basically rejecting the vote, saying there was massive evidence of voter fraud and completely inflaming the nation, and which immediately broke out into massive violence, which continued for 2 months. Now, 2 years after, more than 2 years after these horrific events, Julian Assange himself gave an interview to The Guardian in which he boasted that he personally was responsible for all this. Now, again, he was boasting a little bit. I think that's kind of part of his personality. He's a bit of a self-aggrandizer. But it's important to understand this is not something that I'm accusing Assange of doing. He has boasted of doing it. I'm simply going through the details and saying, well, let's look at what really did happen in Kenya. Who was involved? What was the timeline? And it's very, very clear that it was a British operation. And actually, the most provocative thing that happened was the British government itself officially questioning the vote. Then George Soros putting his rent-a-mobs onto the street. And Soros himself, I have argued, is a British asset. I'm quite sure that he is. I wrote an article some years ago called How the British Invented George Soros. And I think it's pretty clear that that's what he is. So the US government, of course, was also involved in Kenya, but interestingly, in the 2 days or so after the vote, the US was taking the opposite position. The UK was questioning the vote and claiming that their candidate, the one they favored, this guy named Odinga, claiming that he won. And so all these protesters were for Odinga, and the UK was backing Odinga, and so was Assange. The US, for a couple of days, was backing the sitting president, the incumbent, a guy named Kibaki. And then within 2 or 3 days, the US harmonized its position with the UK, which is typically what happens. But most people assume that the US is running the show and the UK is simply a vassal state of the United States and does whatever we say. But when you really investigate dispassionately, without prejudice, and look at how these things really work, you often find these situations, such as I just described, where the British were clearly backing Odinga, the US was clearly not backing him. But then 2 or 3 days later, we came around to the British position. It so often happens that way.
Yeah. And you know that, well, I've been receiving critics because, you know, people like to, well, I think people is programmed to create their own heroes and their own villains. So they say, oh, well, how can you talk bad about Assange, and how can you criticize him? He spent 12 years in captivity. And you know, that's my nature, and I think we need to investigate. That's our job, and that's why the next question, you know, you can say that he spent 12 years in captivity. The question now for you, if you can help us to understand, is why and how do you interpret the imprisonment, and what role did the United Kingdom play in that detention? They broke the relationship. How do you see that period of time?
Well, of course, assuming that my theory is true, that Assange is or was an intelligence asset, probably for the British. You know, intelligence assets, they don't always have a nice, smooth life. They get in trouble. They get the wrong people angry at them. they fall from grace. Sometimes they become double agents. All kinds of things happen. They don't have a smooth life. And so the short answer is I don't specifically know what happened with Assange. I really don't know why they arrested him initially in 2010, and I have no idea why his case was treated in such an extraordinary manner. It's very strange that he was kept in isolation for so many years. How often does that happen? It's very odd. So there was something odd about the whole case, but none of that suggests that he was not an intelligence asset. On the contrary, it suggests that he was, and that he was involved in very deep stuff, and that he knew a lot of things. He was a player, and somehow he ran afoul of the wrong people. And I don't pretend to know the details of that, but I would point out this. Assange, from the beginning, his role model, his idol, was Daniel Ellsberg. When he started WikiLeaks, he said he wanted to be just like Daniel Ellsberg, who you may remember is the guy who released the Pentagon Papers back towards the end of the Vietnam War. Well, Daniel Ellsberg was a CIA asset. That's what he was. And in fact, some people in the US intelligence community, especially in military intelligence, they think the release of the Pentagon Papers was an operation by the CIA to try to put the blame for the Vietnam War on the military, on the Pentagon, as opposed to blaming the CIA for it. That's one theory that's been put out there by people who are actual professional military intelligence people. They say it was an interagency conflict where basically the CIA was trying to blame the Pentagon for the war in the public eye. So I think the real issue with the public is that we have to stop thinking in terms of black and white, in terms of fairy tales, where there are white hats who are good and there are black hats who are bad. Real life in the adult world, let's call it, it's not like Star Wars. It's not like a fairy tale. It's not always good guys versus bad guys. Quite often it's bad guys versus bad guys, or most often of all, maybe people who are just kind of in between, like you and me.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. And you know that this subject really interested me because all it seems that everything behind this is UK, and I'm always interested to know why UK is always there. You know, like messing with things and trying to end things onto to a star revolution. And that's why it's my next question. You know, you make a strong case, and because you're an expert, real expert in this matter, no? You make a strong case for the fact that the color revolutions and communisms were created by the British secret services as a technique to defeat larger, more populous nations from within. Can you help us understand how they did it? Perhaps we can start with George Soros and the color revolution, and then we go with the communism, if you want and if you can.
Sure. The thing about England, about the UK, of course, it's a very small country with a small population and not a lot of natural resources. And yet it became the global hegemonic power that basically ruled the world. Certainly, let's say by 1900, there was no power on earth that could rival the United Kingdom. And I have argued in my writings that the UK initiated and caused both world wars, although the UK, the British like to present themselves as victims of those wars, and they'll say that Germany or somebody else really started it. I think the record is very clear when you look at it that both of those world wars were initiated and planned for a very long time by the British in order to increase their power, and especially to increase their influence over the United States. And what I have documented in my writings, in my books and articles, is that the British formed a plan back in the Victorian era. Even earlier, this plan was already taking place in the Napoleonic era. But in the 1880s, it started becoming very clear to British leaders, and there are books written about this, articles. It's a matter of record. British leaders understood that they could not compete on a level playing field with these growing empires such as Germany and Russia and the United States, which were land empires, empires that grew by expanding their territory by land. The British understood they were vulnerable because their empire was spread all over the world, and it was very difficult to defend, very difficult and costly, even with the Great Royal Navy. They understood that empires such as Russia and America were in a much naturally more defensible position, a stronger position, and would ultimately overcome them. So the British adapted to that by forming a plan which was to merge with the United States, to reach out to the United States and to merge. And the plan that they formed was actually to create a super state of all English-speaking countries and to merge them together. So it was, first of all, a merger between the UK and the US, but because the UK governed all the other English-speaking countries, they too would become part of this giant super state. You know, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, originally South Africa and India were supposed to be included. Their status got a little fuzzier as time went on. But the original plan was put forth in writings, including in the last will and testament of Cecil Rhodes, famously. And he is often accused or credited with being the author of this plan, but he was a very young man. He was only 23, I think, when he first set this to writing. And I don't believe it was his plan at all, because he was a student at Oxford. He was part of a larger group of students who were part of the so-called Imperial Federation movement, or sometimes it's called the Movement for Liberal Imperialism. They were supposedly idealistic people who felt that Great Britain had the most liberal and enlightened culture and values anywhere in the world, and that the best way to spread this liberalism was to conquer the world and to colonize the world and to rule over the world as an English-speaking empire. And so this plan was supposedly set forth by Cecil Rhodes, but I think it really came from the very top levels of the British ruling class. And in fact, almost immediately when Cecil Rhodes put this plan into effect, he started a so-called secret society, I think in 1891. And he was immediately joined by all the really most powerful, wealthiest, most influential people in the British Empire, including the Crown Prince Edward, who would go on to become King Edward the Seventh, I think. So he was the Crown Prince. He was going to be the King of England, and he was one of the three founding members of this so-called secret society of Cecil Rhodes, which eventually came to be called the Round Table. And so this Round Table organization was, it was really simply a sort of working group that enabled the British establishment to focus on this goal of reaching out to all the English-speaking countries and getting them to cooperate with each other and to essentially merge together into a single state. And it goes through many different phases. At first, there was the League of Nations. The American people rejected that. The US Senate voted against it. But then finally, after World War II, and all the pressures that were created on us by World War II, we Americans finally agreed to this British plan of global government and joined the UN, and then eventually in 1949 joined NATO, made the Five Eyes Intelligence Treaty with the five English-speaking countries, again, that original idea. So this merger of all the English-speaking countries, it really happened. And not only are we now joined, all the English-speaking countries are joined in a permanent military alliance, a permanent intelligence alliance, but the whole world has now become basically an English-speaking world, just as Cecil Rhodes and the Crown Prince Edward and all these founders of this imperial federation movement had originally envisioned. And their greatest achievement is that the United States has been brought into this completely British plan and this British infrastructure and is cooperating with the British, something that never, ever would have been conceivable in the 19th century, when there was actually tremendous hostility, continual hostility between the US and the UK, where the US saw correctly that the UK was a continual threat against our independence because they were constantly meddling, waging a trade war, economic warfare against us, and were in a very powerful position to do it at that time. So it was really a huge change that and a great victory for the British and for these imperial activists. It was a tremendous victory that they got the United States to go along with this crazy plan. And now we are living that plan. And a big part of the plan, the way the British play it, is to pretend it was all the Americans' idea, which is an extraordinary flip-flop of propaganda. And so most people today think that President Woodrow Wilson of the United States was the father of globalism and that his idea was to form a League of Nations. It's absolutely not true. Woodrow Wilson was a puppet of British intelligence. His chief advisor, a guy named Colonel Edward House, was a British agent who reported directly to Sir William Wiseman, who was the station chief for British foreign intelligence in the United States. They ran Woodrow Wilson as an asset. They reported back to Sir Edward Grey, the foreign secretary in Great Britain. And in this captured White House, this Woodrow Wilson White House that had been captured and penetrated by British intelligence, this is where all the changes happened in our government that have been so destructive to our independence ever since. In 1913, the creation of the Federal Reserve, which was done under the personal supervision of this Colonel Edward House. And finally, the entry of our country into World War I, which Americans were totally against. And then they tried to get us to join the League of Nations. And Woodrow Wilson had actually announced that it was his idea and urged Americans to join the League of Nations, but it was not his idea. The British had planned this League of Nations as early as 1815, after they defeated Napoleon. And they were continually talking about it. They called it a peace league. They called it by other names. But in, I think it was in 1915, in the middle of World War I, but long before the US had joined the war, the British Foreign Secretary, Sir Edward Grey, wrote a letter to Colonel House, who was a British agent, as I mentioned, saying, we really want to get this peace league going, this League of Nations, but we think it would look much better before the world if the proposal came from an American president. Do you think you can get President Wilson to propose this idea and pretend it was his? And Colonel House said, yes, I think I can do that. And he undertook to do it. And that's exactly what happened. And so to this day, I would say most people in the world who think about these things, they think Woodrow Wilson came up with this idea of the League of Nations, and he didn't. Virtually all of the infrastructure of what we now call the globalist regime, the global world government, was British in origin. You can go back through the timeline and see how the British originally proposed it in some form, usually going back into the 19th century. And then at some point, each and every step of the way, they made some propaganda move to try to pretend that the Americans had proposed it or some other person of some other nationality had proposed it. They covered their tracks very well, but the history shows very, very clearly that the British were behind this whole idea of globalism. It was always their idea from the very beginning, and the Americans were always opposed to it, and even to this day still are. With George Soros coming back into the present, Soros has always made very clear that the United States of America is the biggest threat to the globalist enterprise. And this is because we have a very democratic government, a government which by its nature, by its structure, is very responsive to the will of the people, much more so than a government modeled in the English or the European way, where you have a parliament which can be manipulated or even dissolved by the executive, by even the monarchy. So our form of government is much more democratic than the globalists would like it to be. This causes constant problems for them, such as our rejecting the League of Nations back in 1919. But the other thing is the power and independence of the United States, which allows us to take action independently so that we don't have to necessarily listen to other countries, even if they're our allies. This also is a great annoyance for the people who are pushing globalism. And so humbling the United States, weakening the United States, and now breaking up the United States, we have this movement now that's being very well funded called national divorce, where they want to split up the United States into little pieces. These types of initiatives always come from the globalist center, which is the UK and London. And they have been pushing this agenda for more than 100 years. In the Civil War, which was actually caused by England, they actually provoked the American Civil War through intelligence activity. And their goal, as a matter of record, I wrote an article about this called "How the British Created the American Civil War," something like that, and found many, many records, written records, absolutely proving that the British intentionally started the war and that their end game for the war was to split up the United States, not just into two pieces, but into many pieces. They made a deal with the southern states saying, oh, you can have a confederacy, but they had no intention even of allowing the South, the Southern Confederacy, to remain together. They were going to split up the whole country in many pieces. And that's simply because they wanted us to be more controllable and therefore more useful to them. And that's still their goal to this day. And George Soros, I have given much evidence in my writings, in my books, that he is a British agent of influence. I think it's very clear that he is, and the goal he pushes is clearly anti-American and pro-British.
Hacemos una pausa, amigos, para recordarte que estamos en nuestro canal en Telegram. Abajo en la descripción del video, ahí vas a tener el link. Igual pues tenemos nuestro canal en Facebook y por supuesto estamos también en Rumble tratando pues de tener alternativas, ¿no?, a YouTube. Tenemos por supuesto aquí en el Mercurio herramientas para ti que yo siento que son herramientas muy valiosas, como el grupo de los 50 y nuestra asesoría personalizada. Y estamos permanentemente pues haciendo seminarios para tratar de entender un poco lo que viene, ¿no? En el caso del Grupo 50 y las asesorías personalizadas son dos maneras prácticas para que te sigas preparando, en especial sigas preparando a tu portafolio, a tu capital de riesgo y trates de sacar pues oportunidades en estos eventos de crisis que se están generando y los que vienen y tomes provecho, ¿no? También eso es muy importante. Recuerda que todo esto lo vas a encontrar en el mercurio.com. Ahí hay lecturas gratuitas todas las semanas, lecturas muy valiosas. Y también pues aquí en la descripción del video, en los comentarios fijados. Recuerda ir a nuestro canal en Telegram, ser parte de nuestra comunidad y por supuesto de activar la campanita. Suscríbete y activa la campanita, es una manera realmente importante de ayudarnos. Así que continuamos.
And can you explain us, because you have a recent book related to that, and friends, remember we're talking with Richard Poe, and he's New York Times best-selling author. I will give you in the description of this video the links to his recent book and also to his Twitter and his Substack. Please go there. It's an immense power of information. There you go. How the British invented communism, and it's an incredible book. And perhaps you can give us not the whole thing, but a little bit, because it's really interesting, and people then can go and buy your book. It will be great for our community.
Well, this is my new book. It just came out. Basically, what I argue in this book is that the British invented this whole procedure, this technique of color revolution.
Not the Jews, British.
Right, and deliberately created a propaganda campaign to say that the whole thing had been invented by the Jews, much as I just described that they tried to pretend that globalism was invented by the Americans, and Woodrow Wilson in particular. It's simply how they operate. But the thing is, I discovered that the British actually were behind the French Revolution. This is going back more than 2 centuries. And I suspect as my research continues, I'll find out it goes back even further. But this technique of color revolution, I believe, is what actually built the British Empire. Because if you look at the age of revolution, which started in the late 18th century, and let's say it went until 1917, the Russian Revolution, this so-called age of revolution corresponds exactly with the period of the rise of the British Empire to become the leading global hegemon over the earth. And I don't think that's an accident. I think rather that in my book, I call color revolution the British secret weapon. And it was literally a secret weapon, this technique they developed of secretly overthrowing rival governments, but doing it in such a way that the hand of British intelligence was concealed. It was deniable, because they would create fake revolutions. They would make it appear that the people themselves were rising up and rebelling. And they would create a great fervor among the people to anger against the government. And so in some ways, yes, there was real anger, there was real rebellion, but it was all being orchestrated behind the scenes by British intelligence and for British ends. And so I think if you look at this period, this age of revolution, once you examine closely the facts behind each and every revolution, you find the British were behind it. And in my book, I examine very closely the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution. And it's very, very clear that the British were involved in every phase of the Russian Revolution, including the overthrow of the Tsar and the encouragement of the Bolsheviks to overthrow the provisional government. And then when the Civil War broke out, which was a 5-year civil war, in which the Reds and Whites were fighting for control of the country, the British were supposedly supporting the Whites, but they used that position of influence to undermine the Whites and make sure that the Reds won. And it's very, very clear and undeniable and shocking. It's really quite shocking. So this power to create fake revolutions, to overthrow governments, to basically make governments disappear, governments that you don't like, governments that are opposed to you or inconvenient to you for some reason, to simply make them vanish into thin air. This is a power that the British, I believe, have been exercising for more than 200 years and maybe longer. And it is the science of color revolution, which they have now shared and taught to their allies, us, the United States. Most people in the world think that the US is responsible for all these color revolutions, that we invented it and that we're the ones who run it. But I think it's just like everything else in this globalist enterprise. I think the British are running it.
And going back to the U.S. thing, you argued that Britain managed to implement this state plan, effectively controlling the United States through permanent military and economic treaties, and using the power and wealth of the United States to maintain its own global control. Okay, basically, what the United Kingdom, basically what they done is they has been infiltrated the US and managed it in the shadows. Does that trend continues to this day? It's still very strong. That's the question. And another question is it would be the same effect with a guy like Biden or a guy like Trump in power? It doesn't matter. I don't know if you understand the question.
I think I do. You're just asking, do they still have that kind of control today, and how do they do it?
Yeah.
How can they manage? And this is what most people find very difficult to understand, because they think, well, England is just a little country and the United States is so big. But England was always a little country. It's not any smaller today than it was 300 years ago. It's exactly the same size. And they developed these techniques specifically to enable them to control larger countries and sometimes to destroy larger countries. And the way they do it is called the balance of power, where they get larger countries to oppose each other and to fight each other and to exhaust their strength by fighting each other, while the British kind of play in a middleman role, supervising everything and in some ways manipulating both sides. And I talk in my book about how they did this after World War II, how Winston Churchill personally, he saw the US and the USSR as being a threat. Once they had gotten rid of Germany, he said, well, we're going to be stuck between two great powers, the US and the USSR, and that's very dangerous for us. And so they created the Cold War. They simply pitted the US and the Russians against each other and encouraged them to fight. And that's still going on to this day. So your question of, well, are they still doing it to this day? I would say yes, because the infrastructure they set up is very powerful. The UN, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, all of these, the World Economic Forum. I showed in my book how the World Economic Forum was directly descended from this roundtable group that I told you about. That Klaus Schwab was appointed and mentored by Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger was appointed and mentored by a guy named William Yandell Elliott, who was an American, but he was recruited by the British back in World War I, and he was one of the early members of this roundtable movement. And so the way the British get this kind of power is it's partly through manipulation of the usual sort, through intelligence agencies, through blackmail, through recruiting key people, infiltrating, economic warfare, punishing countries that don't cooperate with economic hardship, turning one country against another. It's partly through that. And if you are sufficiently ruthless and Machiavellian and skillful at doing that kind of thing, at turning countries against each other, at being treacherous in that way, if you've been doing it for many centuries and you're good at it, it's very, very effective. But also, there is the bond of language and ethnicity, which also helps them, because there's a reason they started with the English-speaking countries. They said the English-speaking world is going to be the nucleus of authority, one of them wrote, over this globalist system they were trying to set up. And that's because all of these English-speaking countries, including the US, are former British colonies. And our ties to Britain are very deep. They're very old. They go back hundreds of years. And there is a natural infrastructure. There's a natural enmeshing of important families, intermarriage of important families over many, many generations. And there's the natural kind of colonial attitude. The colony admires the mother country and sees them as having high status, and sees, for instance, Americans see the way that British people speak English as being a better way, that's a better English, it's superior to ours. And these kinds of psychological things are called soft power. They may not seem very important, but they actually are, because the ties that bind all the English-speaking peoples together, these are bonds of blood and culture. They're family bonds. And you can't break such a bond. And this is the bond that the British have used, along with all these other tricks that I've described. They approached this whole project very, very shrewdly, and I have to say successfully. It worked. The world that they envisioned back in the 1880s and 1890s, this is the world we live in today.
Yeah, and it's a shame because the states. Well, actually, I always tell this to my people in our channel, and I tell them, look, guys, the states, they're not our enemy. We can wish them the worst. We can wish them total war or civil war for them. If they're not in order, we're not in order in Mexico or in Venezuela or in South America. So we need to understand they are infiltrated. They need patriots that regain power and make the Constitution again great. But basically, and I want to ask you, Mr. Richard, about basically China. No, you also argue that the British leaders, such as Lord William Rees-Mogg, promoted Western investment in China to turn it into a superpower that could rival the United States. And this policy has resulted in the straightening of China, creating a new global power, and also, of course, dynamic that favors British interests by balancing power between larger nations. Can you give us detail of how you achieve such a monumental goal? Because now it seems we are in the verge of a big war, and these two big rivals, the States and China, and we need to understand why. And if you say that China is a creation also of the modern China, this big industrial machine is an invention of the British. This is really important for us to understand. Can you give us details, please?
Sure. First of all, it's important to understand that British always exercised control over China since the old colonial days. They never made China a formal colony of Great Britain, but they made sure that the Chinese government was always answerable to them. They fought 2 opium wars against the Chinese government to force them to accept opium. And then they set up their headquarters, the British, in Hong Kong. And from that perch, they not only controlled all of China, but they also controlled the other colonial powers. Of course, China at that time was very weak and was split up into zones of influence by other colonial powers, but they all had to obey the British. The British were in charge of the whole show. So it's important to understand that the British have always controlled China since the colonial era began. And they have always regarded it as their special possession. They're very fond of China. And so now what they're doing is raising up China in a balance of power move to be a rival to the United States in the typical way that I described, with this balance of power doctrine, which is the heart and soul of how Great Britain makes its way in the world. And back in the 1990s, as you mentioned, a man named Lord William Rees-Mogg, who was a very influential British journalist, but also much more than a journalist, a very powerful figure in the government, a close family friend of the British royal family, and also a close friend and business partner of Lord Jacob Rothschild, who died recently. So this man, Rees-Mogg, I call him a bridge between worlds, because he had great involvement with the financial world in the city of London and in Hong Kong. He had tremendous interest in Hong Kong and China, and also with the aristocracy and with the royal family, and also with the United States. He kind of specialized in coming to the United States and pretending he was on our side. During the 1990s, he actually set up all kinds of publications and infrastructure to go against Bill Clinton, and he was presenting himself as somebody who was trying to end the Clinton corruption. So he was this kind of guy. He was a real operator, playing people off against each other. But in the early 90s, he wrote a number of articles in the Times of London, basically calling on the global financial community to invest in China for the specific purpose of building up China to be more powerful than the West and the whole West put together, but especially the United States. He called for this expressly and explicitly. And he said that George Soros and his quantum fund would be especially useful in transferring, let's call it dark money, untraceably into China. Fascinating things that he said. And the fact that a man at his level and in a newspaper of such importance, the Times of London, would call for building up China in order to be more powerful than the United States. Now think about that. You would think people in America, journalists in America, would object. You would think there would have been a few articles saying, why is this guy saying this? Why is he against the United States? Nobody said anything. And this goes to the heart of why the British are able to control the United States. Because why this silence? Why doesn't anybody object? Because that's how the special relationship works. The British will say the most outrageous things like that. And in the United States, it's the sound of one hand clapping. Nobody says a word against the Brits, ever. Nobody says anything against them, ever. And that's really how it is.
And can you show us again your book? I'm wondering if we can find this in Spanish already, or it's not yet in Spanish.
Sadly, it is not yet in Spanish. It is in English. You can buy it on Amazon. You can find it on my website, richardpoe.com, on the X platform, @RealRichardPoe. I have a Substack.
Yeah, and I will leave the people all those links, Substack and Twitter, and also the book. Please go there, and it's been a great pleasure. Finally, I just have one more question, Mr. Richard. Is Do you think, because of the British, they made two great things for them: the city of London and the financial world, not the real economy, the financial world and the fiction economy, and also the euro-dollar. They control the euro-dollar. At least they have a big part involved into the euro-dollar. And do you think this globalist idea of the CBDCs, the central bank's digital currency, come from any conceptual or material source related to the United Kingdom?
I haven't researched the source of that, but I would assume it's coming from them because they run the show, in my opinion. I'm quite convinced of that from many years of research. But even more than that, the World Economic Forum is pushing that very hard. And that is definitely, as I mentioned before, an outgrowth of the British Roundtable movement. There's no doubt about it. You can follow the historical timeline exactly. It was created by the same people who created and sustained the Roundtable movement during the early 20th century. And then they created various institutions to keep their agenda going. And the World Economic Forum was created in 1971 under a different name, but it was created by those people. It was created by the same people who had been working with the British Roundtable to create World War I, to create World War II, to draw the United States into a global government and to create a super state of English-speaking countries. These are the same people who created the World Economic Forum. And of course, this CBDC thing is one of their big projects, as all these other things that we're experiencing now in today's world that seem so frightening and terrible to us. They're all being pushed by the World Economic Forum, but they're also being pushed by the UN, which has a formal alliance with the WEF. And these are all British structures, all of them.
And now we have this conflict that it seems to approach to us, Mr. Richard. This bifurcation, these two blocks that are emerging, the West and the East, and it seems that they can talk now. It's only gonna go for worst. And you see the British there, not trying to never talk about peace, only talk about war. And you have Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2, remember? And they're like there, no, trying to push and instigate and trying to avoid that people can come and talk, and that's something that really scares me, because I have two small kids and I don't want them to live in a war in war. Do you think that's possible, that we will have a big conflict?
Well, they obviously are pushing for that. I really don't have a solution to that. That's on, I guess, on the list of things that's way out of my control. Yeah. My naive view as a writer and a journalist is just, I just
no, but
continue
I'm telling you, because you found evidence that the World War I and World War II were their creation.
Yes,
UK
absolutely.
creation, and perhaps they like a World War III also.
Of course. Oh, yes. I didn't understand that was your question. Yeah, yes, I think it's very clear. I mean, you can see how they're pushing all the hot spots in the world. The British are right in the middle of it, and they're the ones who are pushing it the most aggressively. There's no question.
Well, thanks, Mr. Richard. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure and honor. I'm pretty grateful that you've been here. And remember, guys, you will find his Substack and the recent book. The links are going to be there, so go there and find and read. Please read. This book is amazing. And thank you, Mr. Richard. I will ask you for a final salute to our people, and that's it.
Okay, well, I thank you for having me on your show. It's a great honor, and I thank the Mexican people for listening to me. I thank you for your interest in my work. God bless you all.
Well, thank you guys. If you like this content, remember to share it and also to give us a thumb and subscribe to the channel and activate the little bell, please. That's very important. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.